Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at completing the square. This video is useful if you are in AS Maths or if you're in IGCSE Maths. Let's hop into it. When it comes to completing the square, what we're going to cover in this video is the 4 different versions that I use to complete the square. Now, I want to preface this video by saying that there are many different ways to complete the square, and this is just one way. It's the way that I understood the most, and it's the way that I've taught for the last 8 years, and a lot of my students have really resonated with this way of completing the square. But if this one doesn't work for you, there are many other videos explaining different methods out there, and I really encourage you to find the right method for you instead of just giving up if you don't understand how to do it just from this video. All right, so with that out the way, we are basically going to jump straight into how to complete the square. So what is completing the square? Completing the square is taking a standard quadratic equation, which can be expressed as ax squared plus bx plus c, and turning it into another form. Now, this form has many uses, but we're not going to cover those uses in this video. We're simply looking at how to actually complete the square. All right, as I said earlier, there are 4 different versions. So I'm going to be going through each of these versions individually and kind of showing you when you would apply each of these versions to different questions and different scenarios. All right, so we're going to start with version 1, which is the foundation of pretty much all the other versions. So I'm going to break this version up into very small steps that you can understand. But as you'll see, we need to try when we actually answer the question to consolidate these steps, because individually these steps don't actually make any sense. So I'm going to kind of expand it, pull it apart a little bit, but what we will end up doing is kind of bringing it together so that you can do it faster and more correctly. All right, so let's begin with version 1. So in order to understand the differences of the versions, we need to understand when we need to use each version. Now, as I said earlier, your quadratic equation is expressed as ax squared plus bx plus c. Now, we use version 1 if a takes on the value of 1, which basically means that there is no number in front of x squared. So version 1 is the simplest of all the versions because there's no extra steps, because there's nothing in front of x squared. And as you'll see later, we can't really complete the square if there is something in front of x squared, so we need to do some extra steps. But for this one, we're kind of just going with the foundations. All right, so you will know you need to complete the square, not because the question will say you need to complete the square, but it will give you a form or a format to put your quadratic equation in. When we are doing version 1, the form will look something like this: x plus a squared plus b. So if you see a question that says put this in the form this, or convert this to this, or whatever, if you see this form, it's firstly completing the square, and secondly version 1. Okay, so let's break it down into steps. I love my steps. So we're going to start by completing the square with this equation right here. I'm going to break this into many different steps, and then we'll do another example of version 1 just so that you can see how I do it again, basically. All right, so let's start with part 1 or section 1. So part 1 basically has us taking our equation and rewriting it, because often it's very useful to rewrite the question for your brain to absorb the information a little bit better. But step 1 basically has us bracketing off the x's. So excluding the value that has no x, because that is not important until the very end, and we kind of don't want to consider it. It sounds mean, but we kind of want to separate it out of our mind. So we're just looking at the x's. So step 1 is quite simple. We bracket off our x's. Now we're going to do step 2. Now step 2 through to step 5 should actually be done in one step, as you'll see me do many times later on in this video. But for now, as I said, we're going to separate it. But individually, these steps actually make no mathematical sense. So it's very important that while you're practicing, you can separate them to make sure you don't forget any of the steps. But when you actually do it in your exam, you should be doing step 2 to 5 in one go. But I will show you how to do that later on. All right, so step 1. basically has us only looking at the bracket. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take away an x from each term in the bracket. Take away an x from each term in the bracket. In the bracket. Okay, what that basically looks like is we're going to take an x away from x squared, so that's going to simply leave it with x. So we're going to take an x away from 6x, so what that'll mean is it will just be left with the number 6. And then we're going to minus 3. So again, this step doesn't make any sense because where did those x's go? But when you do everything together, it does kind of consolidate itself. All right, now we're looking at step 3. Now step 3 has us dividing the number in the bracket by 2. And it's always 2. Okay, divide the number in the bracket by 2. All right, so what does that look like? Well, 6 divided by 2 is 3, so we're going to end up with x plus 3 minus 3. Okay. All right, what is step 4? Now, step 4 is the easiest of the steps, and that is simply to square the brackets. Okay, because as you can see in the form, the bracket is squared, so we just need to make sure we put that square above the bracket. So we've got x plus 3 squared minus 3. Okay, now we're going to have a look at step 5. Step 5 is the most complicated of all the steps. So I'm going to try my best to explain it, but I think it's going to make more sense in the example. So the idea is to minus the square of the new number. The square of the new number. Now, what is the new number? The new number here is 3, this positive 3, because we have just divided it by 2, so it's new, okay? It wasn't in the original equation. So what we do is we basically are going to accommodate for this expansion. Now, if you're not entirely sure why we minus the square of the new number, if you are interested, let me know, and I will try and explain it in the comments below. But for now, we just need to know that we minus the square of the new number. So the square of 3, sorry, I gave you the answer there. The square of 3 is 9. So outside the bracket, we're going to minus 9, and then we put our minus 3. So don't forget to keep putting the minus 3 or your C value still at the end. But we're not really interested in it until step 6, because step 6 simply has us simplifying. Okay, so we're just going to consolidate these two numbers outside the bracket, and that's going to end up with x plus 3 squared minus, need to do math, minus 12. So that is your final answer, x plus 3 minus 12. All right, I'm going to do another example where I show you how we can consolidate steps 2 to 5 in one go. But if you're still not sure how to do it, please make sure that in your practice you separate them so you don't forget any steps. And then once you feel more confident with the steps, you can do it all in one go. But for the sake of this video, because you can rewind, I'm going to show you how to consolidate them now. All right, so here's another example we're quickly going to do. So let's do it. So what is step 1? Step 1 is to rewrite our equation and bracket off our x's. All right, the simplest step, just so that we can kind of separate it in our mind. Now remember, as I said, step 2 to 5 is going to happen in one go. So I'm going to do this one quite slowly and explain it. But as we go further along in the video, I'm going to be doing it faster and faster. Hopefully you will also be able to understand it better. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take away an x from each of these numbers. That is step 2. So x squared is just going to become x, and 4x is just going to be 4. But it's not going to be 4 because remember, we have to divide the number in the bracket by 2. So now it's going to actually be 2. Then we square the bracket, which is step 4. And then step 5 is minusing the square of the new number outside the bracket. Okay, now you might be asking yourself, in the previous question we had a negative. Now in this question we have a positive inside the bracket. Does that affect the number outside? And the answer is no. You will always minus the square of the new number regardless of the sign in the brackets. All right. And then we add our minus 7. So now we can just do step 6, which is quite simply to simplify. So we have x plus 2 squared minus 4 minus 7 is minus 11. So there is your completed square. I hope I didn't do that too fast, but if you are still getting stuck, remember you can separate steps 2 to 5 into 4 different steps until you're comfortable. But in your exam, it should look something like this, where you consolidate steps 2 to 5 in one go. All right, and it is relatively easy the more you practice it, because practice makes perfect. I know that's cringe, but it's true. All right, let's have a look now at version 2. All right, so version 2 is a little bit more complicated than version 1 because there are some extra steps involved. And this is because version 2 comes about if there is a number in front of x squared. Remember we said version 1 is if there's no number in front of x squared or a equals 1. Now there is a number in front of x squared. So a is greater than 1, okay? So the idea is that the form that will be expressed, you know you're doing version 2 because there's a number in front of x squared, and the form looks something like this. Ax plus b squared plus c. So we have a whole extra number. We now have 3 unknowns we have to find. All right, so let's jump into it. All right, so here's an example that we can do. So step 1 stays the same as in version 1. So we're going to first bracket off our x's by rewriting the equation. Oh, I forgot to bracket this off. There we go. We're going to bracket off our x's. Now, step 2 is where things get a little bit complicated because you can't actually complete the square or do the steps 2 to 5, those consolidated steps from version 1, if there is a number in front of x squared. So we are going to have to remove that number via factorizing. Now, factorizing in the normal sense of what you've probably practiced is finding a common number between the two numbers and then pulling that out. But in this case, we are simply just trying to get rid of the number in front of x squared. Even if the number in front of x doesn't actually go into that number. So for example, let's say instead of having plus 6x, I had 2x squared plus 7x. Now, 7 can't really be divided by 2 and be a whole number, but I'm still going to divide it by 2 because I need to get rid of the 2. That's my main goal, is to get rid of the number in front of x squared. Luckily, in our case, we will get a whole number if we divide 6 by 2. So what does that look like? Basically, we're going to take the 2 out. We're going to be left with x squared plus 3x plus 3. Okay, so don't forget, if it was a 3 in front of it, then we divide by 3. If it was a 4 in front of it, we divide by 4. We're basically factorizing the number in front of x squared out. All right, now step 3 is when we basically consolidate. We do steps 2 to 5 in version 1. Okay, because we are actually completing the square. Steps 2 to 5 is the actual completing of the square. We now are just setting up the equation to have its square completed. All right, but before we do that, I want to say in these questions, I like to use square brackets. So what I mean by that is the 2 is going to sit inside. The 2 is going to sit outside square brackets. Okay, you'll see why we do this just now, but I like to use double brackets because later on when we simplify, we're going to have to expand, and we want to make sure we have a different looking bracket so we know exactly what to expand. All right, if what I said doesn't make any sense, it will in the example. So let's complete the square. So this is kind of 3a, 3b sort of what we're doing. Okay, so again, this is steps 2 to 5 from version 1, which is step 3 in version 2. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to complete the square. So we're going to take away an x from each of the values, divide the number in the bracket by 2, square the bracket, minus the square of the new number. If you're not sure how to square a fraction, you just square the top number and square the bottom number. Close the square brackets. Why did I not make those square? And then we add 3. All right, so the square brackets are there to trap this minused number within brackets, okay? Because if it's not within brackets, you're going to forget step 4. All right, with version 2, I'm just going to quickly insert a note here. With version 2, there are 2 common mistakes that I see. Because we've already divided 6 by 2 when we factorized, a lot of people forget to divide by 2 again when you complete the square. So make sure that you are following the steps and actually dividing by 2 twice if the number in front of x squared is 2. If it's 3, then you'll divide by 3 and then you'll divide by 2. But you always need to make sure that when you're completing the square, you divide by 2. So that's the first common mistake I see. The second common mistake I see is going to happen in step 4. Okay, so what we're going to do in step 4, which is also a new step, is we're going to expand these square brackets by multiplying the 2 into the square brackets. So when we multiply it in, we get rid of the square brackets, and the 2 is going to sit right in front of those brackets. It's not going to multiply into the bracket, it's just going to sit in front of the bracket. But what a lot of people forget to do is to multiply this number to the minus number. That's the second most common mistake I see. So we're going to end up with 18 over 4, which can actually simplify to 9 over 2. So I'm just going to write it as 9 over 2 instead, because I like to have things in its simplest form, plus 3. So don't forget to times out your brackets. Okay, so that's basically step 4. Now, step 5 is very similar to the final step in version 2. Oh, sorry, we're in version 2. In version 1, so we are going to consolidate the two numbers. So we have minus 9 over 2 plus 3, which is minus 3 over 2. All right, and there's your completed square. Okay, let's do another example just so that you can see how version 2 works for a second time. All right, let's do this question. So, what we do, step 1, we bracket off. So we have 3x squared plus 12x minus 4. Now we're going to do step 2, which is the factorizing step, the new step. So this time we're going to pull out 3, and luckily 12 can be divided by 3 as well, but that's not always the case. So remember, you just pull out 3 from both values, or 4, or whatever that number is. So we're going to end up with 3 times x squared plus 4x minus 4. All right, now we're going to do step 3, which is the actual completing of the square. So remember I spoke about those square brackets. So we're going to set up our equation by separating this number from the bracket with a square bracket. All right, let's complete the square. So we take an x away from both terms, which would be step 1. Then we're going to divide this number by 2, square the bracket, and minus the square of the new number. All right, now step 4 is to expand the bracket. So we're going to expand the bracket to both terms. Again, don't forget to do that. So we're going to place the 3 in front of the brackets, and then we're going to multiply 3 to 4, which is minus 12 minus 4. And then step 5, or our final step, is to consolidate those numbers at the end, which will end with minus 16. And there's your final answer. All right, again, if I went too fast, you can always slow down the video or go back to version 1 to make sure you understand fully how to actually complete the square. But if you're happy, let's move on to version 3. All right, version 3 comes about when we have a negative x squared. So you could have a negative number in front of x squared, and we'll do a quick example of that because that's kind of version 2 and 3 combined. I'm going to look at version 3 separately before we combine them because there are some common mistakes that people make when they are doing version 3. So I first want to highlight those common mistakes before we combine version 2 and 3. But fundamentally, version 2 and 3 are the same. They have the same steps, the same factorizing, the same expanding, but there's just different things we have to look out for. So version 3 can be expressed in the form a minus x plus b squared. All right, can you see there is a minus now in front of the bracket because there was a minus in front of x squared. Let's have a look at this equation here. So as you can see, there's a minus in front of x squared. So let's go. So step 1 is the same for every version except version 4. Version 4 is the outlier, but we'll get to it. But for these versions, the first thing we do is we bracket off our x's and we abandon our lovely 2 at the end, and we all feel really bad about that. All right, so now we have step 2. Now, if you remember from version 2, step 2 is to factorize. Now, this is going to be the same, but this is where the first common mistake in version 3 comes. So we're going to take away the minus from x squared, but in taking the minus away from x squared, we have to also take the minus away from minus 7x, or whatever this number is. Now, when I take a minus away from a minus, it's going to change the sign in the bracket. So whenever you factorize out a negative number, it changes the sign in the bracket. So because it was negative 7x, it's now going to become positive 7x. Now, I see a lot of people forget to do this, so make sure that you're really, really concentrating when you are doing this step. All right, then we have step 3. So step 3 is the actual completing of the square with the square brackets and those steps 2 to 5 from version 1. So let's quickly do that. So we take our square bracket, we're going to take away an x from each of the values, divide the number in the bracket by 2, square the bracket, and then minus the square of the new number, close the square bracket, and add the number or minus the number on the end, depending on what it is. All right, again, I'm doing this quite fast, but that is because I have already explained it and I don't want to waste unnecessary time. Again, if you're still struggling, make sure you separate these steps until you feel confident. All right, step 4 basically has us expanding the brackets, okay? Now, this is where the second most common mistake comes in. Oops, I forgot my 7. That looks strange, but we'll deal with that. The 7 is floating away. All right, so now this is where the most common mistake comes in. When we are timesing the negative to negative 49, we must remember that a negative times a negative is a positive. So this is not going to remain as negative 49 over 4, it's going to become positive 49 over 4 plus 2. All right, so don't forget there's a second sign change in step 4. And now step 5 is to consolidate. So we have x plus 7 over 2 squared plus 49 over 4 plus 2, which is 57 over 4. And that is your final answer. It's very similar to version 2, but you just need to remember those 2 sign changes that occur. Let's do another example quickly. All right, let's complete this example. So step 1, we're going to bracket off our x's. Now I'm going to be going quicker and quicker in this video because you should have already practiced these questions with me, or at least kind of gained a further understanding. So if I am going too fast, I apologize. But again, if you're still getting stuck, it means you haven't fully understood version 1. So make sure you go back to that. Step 2 then is to actually factorize, get rid of that number in front of x squared. In this case, it's a negative, so we pull out the negative, and that's going to cause a sign change in the brackets. All right, step 3 is to complete the square with our square brackets. So we take our square bracket, we take away an x from each of the values, divide the number in the bracket by 2, square the bracket, and then minus the square of the new number. Don't forget to close your squared bracket, and we have minus 3. Now step 4 is to expand. Now don't forget about this sign change. So we have negative x minus 5 squared. Now minus times a minus gives me plus 25 minus 3. So what I'm going to end up with is, consolidating it all, gives me plus 22. Now you can move this 22 to the front so that it looks exactly like this, but it doesn't really matter. But I would recommend that you do that in your exam. But as long as the numbers are correct, that's what you're getting marked on. All right, let's move on to version 2 and 3 combined. I'm just going to quickly do an example to show you because it does come up sometimes. Again, it doesn't really change. I just want to show you how we can merge the two. So version 2 and 3 combined are going to look like this. A minus b times x plus c squared. So here we have 3 unknowns to find. Now this is if there is a negative number in front of x squared that is greater than 1. All right, the steps are exactly the same, but now we have to think of double the mistakes we could make. Step 1, what do you think it is? bracket off your x's. Get rid of that 7 so we don't have to worry about it. Now step 2 is to factorize. Now not only are we taking away a number, but we are also taking away a negative. So the sign is going to change and the number is going to change. So if we pull out negative 2, we're going to end up with changing the sign, which is negative, dividing 12 by 2, which is equal to 6. Okay, so we have to think about double the amount of stuff that time. Now we complete the square, which is very much the same as any other version we've done. So we take away an x, divide the number by 2, square the bracket, minus the square of the new number, and write that 7 on the end. Now we are going to expand the bracket. So double things we have to think about. Make sure we're multiplying that second number by the negative and the 2 this time. So we have negative 2x minus 3 squared plus 18 minus 7, and then we can consolidate the terms. So we have x minus 3 squared plus 18 minus 7 gives me plus 11. And again, you can move this number to the front, but for now, I'm just going to leave it. All right, that's version 2 and 3 combined. Let's move on to version 4, the outlier. Now, version 4 is a strange version because we're not actually completing the square. Let me show you why. Because the form is ax plus b squared plus c. Now, remember I said to you that you can't really complete the square if there's a number in front of x squared, which is why we have been factorizing in version 2 and 3. So what do we do now? Well, we're actually going to approach version 4 a very, very different way because we're not going to complete the square. We are just going to find a, b, and c individually. Now, version 4 can only come about if the number in front of x squared is a square number. So 4 or 16 or 9. But any number that is a square number, this will not work. It's also the rarest of all the versions, but I have seen it come up in past papers before, so it would be very bad of me to not cover it. All right, so we're going to start by trying to find a. So a is quite simply the square root of the number in front of x squared. Number in front of x squared. All right, so the number in front of x squared in this case is 4. So we basically take the square root of 4, which is equal to 2. Now, off to the side, what I like to do, or right underneath my example, or my goal, is I like to write every number once I've found it, because I'm basically trying to fill in this form. All right, so b is the most complicated to find, so let's figure out how we find b. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the value in front of x squared and we're going to divide it by 2. So, sorry, not in front of x squared, in front of x. So we're going to divide 24 by 2, and it's always dividing it by 2. So we're going to divide number in front of x by 2, number in front of x by 2, and then what we're going to do is we're basically going to use the formula a times b equals this number over here. So a being the number we've just found and b being the number we need to find. So let me show you the example. Our number here is negative 24. So we're going to take negative 24 and divide it by 2, which is equal to negative 12. That means that a times b is equal to negative 12. Now we already know that a is equal to 2. So we can say that 2 times b is equal to negative 12. And if we rearrange the equation, b is then equal to negative 12 divided by 2, which is negative 6. So that's how you find b. All right, now we need to find c. Now, finding c is the most standard of what we've done. So remember what we do once we found the bracket is we tend to minus the square of the new number. So the new number, which is the number by itself, is 6. So we minus the square of the new number, and then obviously we've now forgotten about plus 9, so we need to add the plus 9 on the end. Okay, so c is simply consolidating those two numbers once you've found the square of the new number. So minus 36 plus 9 is minus 27. So that is your completed square. All right, I'm not going to do another example because This version is very, very rare, and as you can see, we found A, we found B, we found C. So go and practice this version a few times, but I wouldn't worry about this as much as the other versions. Please make sure that you really go over version 1, 2, and 3 and how 2 and 3 combined. That is the most important. All right, so as I said in the beginning of my video, this is just the way that I complete the square. I hope it made sense to you. If it didn't, again, finding other videos is completely your own choice, and I would recommend it. If I don't explain something in the best way for you, that just means we're not a good fit, and that's perfectly okay. But basically, this is how I've taught it for my students for 8 years, and it's worked. So I just thought I'd share it. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!